Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Paresa Noble. Paresa, thanks for being here again today.
Hello, thanks for having me. Excited to be here as always.
Yes, likewise. Exciting episode today. We've got a couple of great guests today. Later in the show, we're going to have Wayne Holtham, who's the VP of our Asia Pacific office here at Third Stage, and we're going to talk about enterprise asset management later in the show. And before we get to that segment, though, we have another guest that's going to join even before Wayne, Amy Cooper from Kraft, not the cheese company, but a technology company called Kraft that does supply chain solutions for organizations. And so we've got a pretty long segment of questions we're going to ask Amy about supply chain management, some of the trends that she's seeing in the marketplace, as well as some of the challenges that a lot of organizations are facing with their supply chains here in the 2020s. So before we get to that, though, before we get to the interview with Amy and into the deeper discussion about supply chain management, I know, Paresa, you had some observations and thoughts around the whole concept of supply chains and supply chain disruption and supply chain management here in 2021. What are some of the things you're finding?
Yeah, well, it's now more of a prominent part of the conversation than I think it ever has been before, just because we've seen so many blockages in the past year, given the pandemic, given multiple things, mostly because of the pandemic. But it's interesting to see how each industry is trickling into other industries. So I found a list of kind of the top 10 items that you don't really think about that are now facing shortages. And it's a pretty broad range, I gotta say. We have everything from like lumber to chicken wings. So I thought, hey, let's run through each one of these so that we can, you know, count our blessings and say thank you that I have chicken wings today, because it's apparently becoming more and more in demand, even though the supply is not necessarily keeping up. So I'll start with number one. Apparently, there is a huge chlorine shortage, and this was at the top of the list of an article that I saw. And granted, all of these shortages are global, but here in the U.S., we have a large plant that produces chlorine and pool and spa treatment products, and it caught on fire in August. And that's a big reason why there is a shortage this summer, and they're actually projecting the cost of chlorine to increase up to 58% than it has before. Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy. Who knew that chlorine would be have a supply chain disruption like that? That's not the first thing that would come to mind, or one of the first things, but interesting that it's affected even the chlorine industry.
I know, right? I was shocked to see that at the top of the list because there's so many other things. But the second one makes sense, gasoline. Especially here in America, there was the cyber attack on the Colonial Pipeline, as we talked about in our last episode. But even before that, so it sounds like just in general, people were not driving as much during the pandemic. So the need for gasoline dwindled at the beginning. And then the drivers, I mean, I imagine there's a handful of different ways that gasoline is delivered, but drivers, that are driving the big semi trucks with gasoline, they left the industry because there wasn't a need for it. So that, on top of the cyber attack, makes right now we're seeing an increase in gas prices, and there's a shortage in gasoline. So there's that. Um, you have rental cars. The rental car industry, again, people weren't traveling in 2020 as much, and their need for rental cars, went down. Especially, I mean, if you're not driving your own car, you're probably not going to go rent a car and drive that car. So these rental car companies sold a third of their fleet, and then now, when people are traveling again, it's about $300 a day USD to rent a car in some places a day, just because
Wow.
there's a shortage in rental cars.
And a shortage in cars overall. I was reading recently how car lots for new inventory are completely scarce. Just they can't produce fast enough, and part of it is the chip shortage. I know you mentioned it in one of the earlier episodes of this show about the chips, the certain types of chips for like sensors on the cars, or cameras when you're reversing the car, whatever the case may be. There's a shortage on those, and that's making it impossible for them to completely finish the cars in the production lines.
It's just crazy because you think about it, and this chip conversation, I know you and Amy talk about it, but a lot of it comes down to supply increasing in all the things that those chips are used for, because it's used from things like, a PlayStation, it's used in your refrigerator, it's used in, almost, I'm not going to say everything, but there's a lot of different products that use this chip. So the spike in demand kind of came out of left field, but also some of these companies, these car companies, were thinking, maybe we aren't going to be selling as many cars. We don't need to, you know, put in the forecasting side of it, and they got the forecasting wrong. So, I mean, there's just so many things that can happen. Like, yes, of course, COVID came in and completely threw everything for a loop, but are companies forecasting correctly? Are they, able to recognize the trends that would say, oh, there's going to be a spike in this product, or is it totally random, But yeah, to your point, the chips, it's a reason why there was a shortage in 2020 for cars, which is probably why these rental car companies sold off a lot of their inventory to make extra cash, and then now they're finding themselves in a bind. I wonder if people are paying that 300 a day, or if they're still in a bind.
Yeah, I don't know. My wife and family and I are going on vacation here in a couple of weeks, and we looked at rental cars, and it was actually $300 a day.
Was
Where
it?
we're going, and we thought about it, and then we thought about, well, maybe we just rent a car for a couple days, but we decided we're just not going to rent a car when we go there.
Interesting. So
Yeah, it's
you
just
know it
way too expensive.
firsthand. That's way too expensive. For a couple of days, you're paying $600. That's
Yeah,
too much. Too much.
yeah,
I'll walk.
exactly. That's kind of where we landed on it. Rent a bike or something.
There you go. The next one on the list was chicken wings. And this one, struck a chord with me because
Chicken wings.
what
Wow.
are we going to do without chicken wings, right? But this one, apparently, according to this article, Texas, for example, and the surrounding states, they're big in chicken production, I guess. And there was a huge storm that hit Texas earlier this year, and it halted a lot of production. And I don't know if, maybe some of the chickens didn't make it or what happened, but that was their reasoning of why there is a chicken shortage, is a spike in people wanting comfort food and eating chicken wings, and a storm hitting the main areas that chicken is being um, farmed, I guess.
Yeah.
Taken care of.
So it's just chicken wings, though. It's not chicken breast or legs or anything. It's just the wing. Is that
It
what it said?
can't be. I mean, if there's chickens, there's chicken wings, right? So I imagine it's all chicken, right?
Yeah. I
Breast, everything. But this article is just talking about chicken wings.
yeah. Interesting.
I know. And then to piggyback off that, hot dogs and bacon, because people are outside grilling, and there is a spike in demand for hot dogs, and they weren't ready for it. So now there's a spotty supply situation going on.
Hmm.
I know.
That's interesting. The hot dog thing is interesting in grilling outside because it's like, you wonder, is that just because of COVID, or is the sort of demand you might expect this time of year for, at least for the northern hemisphere of the world, where it's getting warmer and people are starting to grill more. But
Right.
yeah, that's
I mean, I think I would have to say, probably to your point, the first one, because COVID pushed everybody outside. I mean, the comfort zone is now outside. So if people are outside more and they're grilling out, that's how they're getting together with their friends and family
yeah.
more than they have in the past. I don't know. If you're in the hot dog industry, would you be able to, foresee that coming so you can forecast correctly? Maybe it's another forecasting problem.
Yeah, exactly.
The next one's kind of, it makes sense and it's a little heavier, but oxygen. I mean, with COVID-19, the hospitals were using a lot of their oxygen, and now there's actually an oxygen shortage. And the World Health Organization is actually pouring, I think it was like $6 billion into that industry to help get it back up and going, and meet the demand needs for it. So that one, it makes sense. It's something that is pivotal, especially right now. So hopefully that one bounces back soon. So
Yeah.
And then to piggyback off of that one, blood. There's been a low donor turnout due to the pandemic, and there's a shortage in blood supply. Um, those two things, when it comes to your health, and I guess food, kind of depending on the food. That's when things can get scary on a shortage. So, those two things are kind of hard to grasp. And then the other one was what we just talked about was cars, new cars, the chip shortage. And it was because of faulty forecasting and an increased demand that a lot of these companies didn't see. And then the last one was lumber. And lumber is interesting because it's used across so many different industries that, not only is the cost of lumber going up, but it trickles into the real estate world. And new single family homes, at least in the US, are 35,000, almost $36,000 higher than the average that they were at because the cost of lumber has gone up so much because
Wow.
of the shortage.
Yeah,
Interesting stuff, right?
that's super interesting. I think raw materials in general, not just lumber, but steel. You mentioned chips, being a raw material for a lot of organizations or an input into a lot of manufacturing organizations. It seems like just from what we're seeing from clients, raw materials as a generalization are in high demand and short supply. So I think
Right.
it goes even beyond the lumber piece of it.
Oh, it does. I know aluminum is on a shortage also. And when I was doing research into aluminum, a lot of what I got was it's because of the high consumption of beer and
Right.
people drinking beer cans, and these breweries can't have people, or couldn't at least have people in their brewery, so they're canning all their beer. I don't know. Do you prefer beer in a can or beer in a bottle, Eric?
Well, I prefer draft out of a tap, but if I had to choose beer or aluminum or bottle versus can, I'd go with bottle for sure. If it's a can, I'd pour it into a glass probably, but something about a bottle, I don't know, it just feels it's easier to hold and I don't know, easier to drink from, in my opinion.
I
Tastes
agree.
better.
It does taste better. They say it doesn't, that there's no difference, but there is. It tastes better.
It could just be psychological. I have no idea, but to me,
Probably.
it tastes better.
Probably. But it's interesting to see all of the different reasons that trickle into each of these shortages. Of course, COVID was kind of a catalyst that pushed a lot of these supply chain issues, but I mean, you're seeing things from a fire all the way to a cyber attack to a storm. A lot of I think another one was shipping containers, and it's because I think it was because a lot of these containers are made in China, and there's just been an increase in demand and certain things that apparently use those containers, and there's not enough. It's just a supply and demand thing. So I think that kind of translates into, do we make containers close to home, or are we utilizing vendors overseas? So there's just so many different factors that could play into a supply chain blockage that sparked the question in my mind: can a supply chain management software help you anticipate at least some of these blockages, or do you think that data could help provide some insights, for example, in demand, if it's tracking trends in the demand? Or what are your thoughts on that? Can a SCM software help you mitigate supply chain blockage?
Yeah, it can to some degree. I mean, there's certain things you can't predict, like a pandemic, say, for example. I don't think even the best supply chain management technology out there could have anticipated that. But I think what the pandemic and the after effect of the pandemic did is that it exposed a lot of weaknesses in people's supply chains, whether it's because they were overly dependent on production outside of their home country. And in some cases, by the way, a lot of countries or a lot of companies don't have a lot of choices. They have to look outside of their own country for certain products, like chips. Chips is a good example. Not many countries can provide the chips that are in short supply right now. And I know, here in the United States, where we're based, for example, there's initiatives to try and incentivize more companies to start producing chips in the U.S. so that we don't have run into these global supply chain issues. So I think that's part of it. And the other thing is, the other part of it is the vendor diversification. Making sure that you have plan A, plan B, plan C. If vendor A can't get you what you need, who's vendor B, who's vendor C, and do you already have, pre-negotiated rates with those vendors, and Do you have a good relationship with those vendors? And can you anticipate when you might need to use those vendors before you actually need to? So those sorts of things supply chain management systems can help with, but you also need sort of a behavioral mindset shift to go along with that in the way you think about your supply chain. So it's a technology, process, and people issue for sure. And the other part of it too that we didn't really talk about, but I think it contributes to a lot of these supply chain issues we're seeing in the market. And we're hearing this a ton from our clients, especially in the U.S. I don't know that we're hearing it as much in other from clients in other parts of the world, but in the United States, I know there's ironically a labor shortage for a lot of skilled labor and people that might be, for example, driving trucks or working on a manufacturing shop floor or working in a warehouse. And it sounds strange saying that because unemployment is still fairly high in the U.S., but yet companies can't find people. And clients we talk to, a lot of the speculation is because of the higher government benefits that are being offered by people for being unemployed, that there's not as much of an incentive for people to go back to work now that these job openings are opening up more. So I think when you add the labor factor to the mix too, in addition to the materials and the overall supply chain, then you add the labor piece of the supply chain that's also strained. All that stuff is creating a bit of a perfect storm here in this world that we're living in right now.
Right. It's so interesting to see those unemployment rates and, I think it's like a record job opening rate too, just across the board. That reminds me, I think it was the governor of Oklahoma is implementing something where he's just incentivizing people to go back to work. So you get, if you find a job, you get $1,000 or something like that. So got to find a way to incentivize people to get back to work so that we can kind of close that gap and help these supply chain shortages, right?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And they've got a couple options. They can either increase capacity in the supply chains, or they're going to have to raise prices. Which either way, I think that has an impact on inflation and consumer prices and things of that nature. So, I'd be curious to see how it pans out. But to your point, yeah, technology and transforming supply chains is critical, and I think it's a super cool area right now, and it's so top of mind for a lot of organizations who maybe were limping along okay with the supply chains they had and the processes and procedures they had in place, but now they're realizing, hey, we kind of got caught flat-footed here, and we need to really optimize the supply chain to avoid these sorts of problems to the extent we can in the future, and sort of open up more of that capacity.
Right. And it's so interesting to hear what Kraft does because they're helping their clients kind of pick up on these different data points and build a story out. I mean, in your conversation, I'm excited for us to get to that, but in the conversation, it sounds like they're collecting all these different data points from, traffic on a website to, you know, I don't know, different consumer behavior and different data points that build a story that could tell you what your supply chain is going to do so you can kind of be proactive rather than reactive, which I think a lot of companies could have used that in 2020. Although I don't know if they would have been able to predict a pandemic like you said, but still probably would have been helpful.
Yeah, you might as well have your supply chain as optimized and as healthy as you can get it, and to the extent you can manage the things that you can control and anticipate, you'll be able to. You can't, you don't want to just assume that, well, we can't do anything about it anyway, so let's just see what happens. You want to make sure you're at least you got an infrastructure in place to be able to adjust if you miss it or you're off in terms of how you predict things are going to go. At least you've got a supply chain that's flexible and adaptable to whatever might happen in the future, and that's a big part of what we'll talk about here in this interview with Amy from Kraft and some of the different technologies that are out there. I think a lot of times organizations, when they think about supply chain management software, they think about basic procurement and just setting up item masters and vendor masters in a system and tracking products throughout the supply chain. But to your point, what we'll talk about in this interview is how there's technology out there, including the technology that she represents or works for, which is a sort of a augmentation, if you will, or an add-on to traditional supply chain or even ERP software, where it's meant to help you manage and anticipate supply chain issues better in conjunction with traditional supply chain software. So I think that's the key, is to really look at all the different data points and understand what's happening holistically through your entire supply chain. So that'll be a good conversation to get to here in a second.
Yeah, I'm excited.
All right, with that, let's go ahead and get to our interview with Amy from Kraft. We'll talk more about supply chain management trends right after we take a quick break. You're listening to Transformation Ground Control.